little sweetheart.
They can't do nothing because I tap dance.
This is WVCR 88.3 FM, The Saint. You are listening to Calling Out Controversy, featuring hosts Andrew Hecht and Justin Kenyon.
All right, hello everybody. I'm Justin Kenyon. Andrew has the night off, so hopefully he is able to join us in soon. I mean, Andrew, the show is just not the same without you, so please come back as soon as possible. We need you. All right, so starting off for current events, we have a clip from MSNBC covering a recent Fox News poll that came out comparing rates for Democratic primary candidates, especially the top five being Warren, Sanders, Biden, Buttigieg, and Harris, and seeing how they face against Donald Trump. So we'll roll the clip, and if you guys want to watch it afterwards, we'll give you the link in the description of the video on YouTube. So here we go.
From Fox News, the new polling from Fox appears to back up those very same leaked numbers.
Joining us now, NBC national political correspondent Steve Kornacki, who has information on non-leaked polls. These are published polls.
These are polls anybody can see, so let's take you through this. This is, as Stephanie says, the new Fox News poll. This one came out.
And that's the president's favorite network.
Well, listen, Fox News is a reputable poll. So let's be clear about this. So what you're looking at here, this is a reputable public poll, and this is what they found, and it's consistent with what other pollsters are finding from other outlets who are checking in right now, and it's what you see here. You match the president's name up against the sort of most likely Democratic opponents he could face. You see a lead there for Biden, 10 points. That's the best the Democrats doing in this poll. You get down to Buttigieg, Harris. It's close. Even they, though, a 1-point advantage over Trump right now. So you see these prospective Democratic candidates early on with an advantage over Trump. What does that mean? What that speaks to is it speaks to what I think has been sort of the permanent political condition of Donald Trump's presidency, and that has been an approval rating. You see the average approval rating. If you look at every poll that's out there right now on Trump's approval rating, it's an average of 43.9%. In this Fox News poll, I think it clocks in at 45%. A president who is in the low and maybe on a good day mid-40s in his approval rating is probably going to be trailing prospective opponents in polling like this. The question with Trump, as it was in 2016, when he was not a popular candidate by any conventional metric, is can he ultimately, if it's Biden, if it's Sanders, whoever it is, can he ultimately make his Democratic opponent in 2020 as unpalatable to a lot of voters as Trump himself is? Trump was able to do that with Hillary Clinton in 2016. It created just the right set of circumstances for him to win. You look at these polls and you say, looks like it's the same story in 2020.
And
same challenge for him.
That hasn't even begun yet. So walk us through how this is still very early and how things could change quickly, because when you put the entire thing into perspective, the entire GOP, they look at polls every day, and they have gotten in lockstep with the president in fear that not standing with him will cost them an election.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, again, so much of this is, I say 2016. You remember 2016? In October 2016.
We don't remember it as well from the polling, though. Think about where we were at this point.
Well, yes. Yeah. So at this point,
the president was in laughingstock territory.
Early on, he moved up very quickly in the Republican race. I think we had a poll that came out around this time in 2015 that put Trump at about 1% in the Republican race. But he moved up very quickly, I'd say, in that Republican race. He got in the race. He got that first debate. He was in command of that race, or he was leading that race by the summer of 2015.
Look at that.
But for 3
From
days.
1%.
That's before the first debate.
But I tell you, except for about 3 days in November when he fell behind Ben Carson by a couple points, he led wire to wire in that Republican race. So when we say it's early and it changes a lot, it is early. It can change a lot. But Trump was locked in from a pretty early point.
What are
there
the
in 2015.
milestones to you about when people start paying real attention? When the poll matters because people have really heard the candidates and really given them consideration, and it's not about name recognition?
Yeah, no, and I think you talk about two different things here. In terms of the primary, I think they are tuning in right now. I'm very curious what the audience is going to be for this Democratic debate coming up. But we saw in 2015, that first Republican debate, you're looking at 25 million people tuned in and watched that. I think you're going to see a level of interest that's sort of on par with that, I would guess, for this one. In terms of the general election, look, again, to me, the question is, Trump seems like somebody, the verdict on Trump, people's views of Trump, I'm not sure how much they've changed since 2016 at all. The variable is what's the view of his Democratic opponent going to be when that on Election Day 2016, Hillary Clinton's favorable score, her favorable rating in the exit poll was 43%. That was just low enough to give Donald Trump an opening. After a campaign with Donald Trump, what is Biden's? What is Sanders? What is Warren's? Whoever the Democratic nominee. Are they north of 43? Then I think the Democrats positioned to capitalize on these numbers. Are they south of 43? Then maybe Trump's got a chance. Is it at 43? Has anything changed at all?
All right, so it definitely is an interesting poll to look at. Part of the fact that it is from Fox News, as they repeatedly point out in the video. And so it's a little surprising to see it come from Fox, but still, it's kind of, in my opinion, not really as important of a poll as people like to make it seem. I mean, it's so early. There's many candidates. We haven't even had the first debate yet. Trump hasn't really even rolled out his re-election campaign yet. So does this poll really mean anything? To some people it may, some it might not. They also kind of neglected to report one thing on the margin of error, stating that Harris, Warren, and Buttigieg are actually within the margin of error of plus or minus 3 points. So in some regards, they should actually be considered tied, or Trump has the ability to be up 1 or 2 points, and so do Warren, Harris, and Buttigieg. So it's kind of strange that they listed at the bottom. If you watch the video, you can see they're most likely not going to report it, because that kind of takes away from the story from having 5 people on top rather than 2. So it's kind of just like, oh, there's 5, not 2. So it gives you more of a bang for the story than you would if you got 2. So coming up, I mean, they got Biden, Bernie, 2 guys who were having increasingly high poll numbers in 2016. Biden didn't run in 2016 for a plethora of reasons. He said everything from family to that his son wanted to run, he didn't run in the end. Bernie ran, but some argue that he got screwed over by the DNC, and Hillary was given the nomination because it was her turn. So it's kind of interesting to see that these two were kind of holdovers from 2016, and that election are on top of the mountain, so to say. But it's still early. They even point out that going off of the 2016 polling is that it was all wrong. In 2016, with a similar poll, although it didn't match them against the president because 2016 Obama was term limited. Trump at the beginning was at 1% or around 1% or less. If we went off polling right then and there, Jeb Bush would have been the candidate and possibly even president. We would have had a third Bush presidency, which would have been unprecedented because we've only had 2 presidents from the same family in the past. Yeah, unprecedented president. It would have been interesting. But there's many things that are wrong with polling that people don't want to admit. Many people don't like to admit to pollsters that they might be interested in a candidate that is unpopular. They like to call it tyranny of the majority in polling. And people who specialize in public opinion studies go over it a lot, where people were kind of lie to pollsters because they think it's unpopular. They think it's unpopular to vote for a Donald Trump, so to say, or a libertarian candidate like Gary Johnson, or a Green Party candidate like Jill Stein, or somebody else who may not be deemed as popular. So if you're in a race and you have one candidate that's deemed racist or sexist or deemed too extreme or crazy or a crackpot, and then you got this other person who's kind of seen as the savior or the anointed one, the kind of the messiah of American politics, you won't really come out and say like, oh yeah, I'm going to vote against that person. You're going to come out and say like, hey, I'm all for Hillary, not for Trump. I mean, John Stossel in 2016 ran a kind of a election betting site, although it's kind of illegal to bet on the presidential elections in the United States, but people in England actually like to bet on our election. And I believe around 2016, he had Trump down on the percentage chance to win. I think he had Hillary Clinton like 96%, and Trump still won. So it was definitely interesting to see how he got that wrong. And John Stossel's a libertarian himself, so he probably would prefer to see somebody like Trump in rather than Hillary Clinton. But now, since we see Biden is now trying to run a campaign similar to George W. Bush in 2000, trying to run mainly off name identity, mainly off coming off the Obama presidency. People are going, oh, I love Obama and all this other stuff. So he's trying to play off that. But it's interesting to see how he comes off now, since Obama's not there to take all the press scrutiny. Obama was smooth with the press. Biden is a gaffe machine, and he doesn't know how to play off it like a George W. Bush or Donald Trump would. Donald Trump knows how to make himself look like an idiot, but make himself look smart doing it. Biden doesn't. Bush knew how to make himself kind of like laugh it off his shoulders and be like, he made a mistake, whatever. It's a Bushism. Biden, on the other hand, can't really do that. Biden is a number 2. He's not a number 1. He's not an alpha. He can't, right now it seems at least, he can't hold himself. And this is just my opinion. So it kind of seems like, to make a little sports analogy, he's a Alvin Harper versus Obama's Michael Irvin. If any of you are Dallas Cowboys fans or were watching football back in the early 90s, Michael Irvin would get most of the hard coverage by the cornerbacks like Deion Sanders and the other big ones of that era, where Alvin Harper would look big and good because he wasn't getting the big coverage. But then when his contract was up and he got big offers from like Tampa Bay Buccaneers, he kind of faded into obscurity because he couldn't handle being covered by the big names. So it's kind of just like that with Joe Biden. He's run twice before and failed. He got in trouble for plagiarism before. He's got in trouble for plagiarism again, actually, now. But it didn't affect him as much as Ian Kinnock's when he stole basically his entire speech word for word. And basically an entire speech. It wasn't like Melania Trump, where she stole a few lines because of her speechwriter. He stole full speeches. So it's going to be interesting to see how this holds up, because we still have 23 candidates. So everybody's going to be vying for airtime. Everybody's going to be vying for something. And everybody's going to try playing off something. Kirsten Gillibrand had a woman go next to her and say, hey, I'm just looking for the ranch. Once you go like, oh, hey, and it's like, I'm just looking for the ranch. And the next thing you know, you see a video of her working out, wearing a shirt that says, I'm just here for the ranch. So she's trying to play off the comedic bit, although it doesn't really work well for her, but she's trying to in order to get some notoriety or whatever. And there's 23 candidates and only so many votes that can go around, so many percentage points in these polls that can go around, that there's just not enough air right now for these people, for all of them. So you're going to see a lot of bickering and everything at the table coming up for these two debates. And you're going to probably see an end to these moments where the Democrats are kind of just like, we're all best friends. We're not competing. Let's all sing Kumbaya, instead of being at each other's throats and actually campaigning against each other. It's not going to be like that anymore. I mean, Chris Christie and Marco Rubio were friends. I mean, they would go out for ice cream all the time, all each other, and Jimmy Fallon used to like make fun of Chris Christie for that on his show, but they still were at each other's throats, and Chris Christie is kind of credited with taking down Marco Rubio in 2016 for Trump. So it's kind of a different in how they do it, but Biden, as I said, is still trying to run off this Obama feel-good message of just like, I'm the next Obama. I was with him for 8 years. I'm his guy. Although he says he doesn't want Obama to kind of just like endorse him, but it's also going to be interesting to see how Biden and the rest of these candidates face up to this scrutiny. I mean, we saw this last time around with the Republicans. It came down, and it keeps on going down to about 2 or 3 candidates who have a fighting chance. We saw this in 2016 slightly with Trump versus Cruz and Hillary versus Bernie. We saw this with Obama versus Hillary. It usually comes down to 2 or 3 people who have a fighting chance. The rest are kind of there because they want to be there, or they want to get more notoriety, or they want to bring the debate a certain way, or they just kind of want to go like, "Hi, Mom, I'm here," and then they leave. It's not really worth it for them. There's only a few that have a fighting chance, and people just don't want anybody to be president. They want somebody special. They want somebody they think is special. Kind of like people like to go like, "Oh, Donald Trump, only a reality TV show host." But if you look at the perspective of people created by like watching him on that show, he seemed like he was a Fortune 500 billionaire CEO. He had the control of everything. It's all optics. And Roger Stone talks about this a lot, about how that show helped him out before Roger Stone obviously got arrested. There are even some that argue that Ronald Reagan wouldn't have been able to become president if he didn't play the hero all the time in Hollywood. That if he played the villain, which he only did one time in a movie called The Killers, he wouldn't have been able to become president because he would not have had this feel-good win one for the Gipper image. So we're probably going to see a bunch of people dropping out. It's also too early to do this poll because, as we've talked about earlier, is that polls change, people's views change. There haven't really been enough events yet, and there haven't really been any sound bites yet, any big things, which we're probably going to see when we finally see the debate stage happen, with the 2-night debates that they have coming up. So we'll see how that goes and see how that affects the whole entire plethora of candidates that we have in front of us. Whether it stays at 23, whether we add another, which I doubt, or we see a bunch of others drop out, which is more likely. It's this weakness with this poll, to wrap this up, is that it's way too early and there's not enough to go around yet. The thing that's going on right now is that we see this kind of shift in the Supreme Court since Anthony Kennedy was replaced with Brett Kavanaugh, kind of seeing this new urge for a new swing vote. So as many of you may recall, is that in the past, before he retired, Anthony Kennedy was the swing vote. He was a conservative judge for the most part, but on certain social issues, like gay marriage, for instance, he would swing. He would decide a case. So on some of these cases where you see a 5-4 majority in favor of the normal minority Supreme Court justices, 9 out of 10 times, or maybe 99% of the time, it would be from Anthony Kennedy swinging. So we kind of now see this now with Roberts. Roberts is now trying to keep the court apolitical, as he says, or as he talks about a lot. He says this a lot on college campuses. So he wants to keep it kind of as an apolitical body, when a lot of people are now accusing the Supreme Court of being politicized. You see a lot of candidates, especially on the left, where we've talked about this in the past, with Pete Buttigieg having the plan of having 5 conservative, 5 liberal, and having 5 judges be decided by the Supreme Court. And we see a bunch of other ones talking about court packing and how it's become too conservative and all these other things. So Roberts himself is now trying to be a swing vote. He's trying to act as that new Kennedy to fill the void that he left. So we see him talk about trying to be apolitical, and how he fears that himself, though, that the judiciary, especially the Supreme Court, has become politicized a little bit, but he's trying to avoid that. He's talked about in the past about how you can see about how it's become more polarized and more politicized by the number of votes that candidates have gotten. Some of the earlier candidates that are in the Supreme Court right now have almost clear majorities in the Senate, more than 60, 70, 80, and some even have, I believe, around over 90. But now if you go like Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Sotomayor, and some of these earlier justices, it's a very slim majority. So you can kind of either chalk that up to politicizing times around right now, or just politicized in the Senate. It depends on what perspective you take. And with all these big cases coming up, like we have a gerrymandering case coming up that was just decided today, that was thrown out. We had another case thrown out with the Christian Baker in Colorado. So right now it seems to be going more right with these cases, but Roberts is trying to make it seem that it's not a conservative court, as many people like to argue, and many people like to argue with many cases in the modern era, even before Roberts was the Chief Justice, with stuff just like the 2000 recount, where like to say Bush stole the election because it was a conservative court and they took it to the Supreme Court, not the Florida court, which then if it was that way, conservatives probably would have flipped and said it was a liberal court. So he's trying to do this now. We haven't really seen it much yet, but in the future, we'll probably see him flip on some cases. He already upset some conservatives by supporting Obamacare and the individual mandate in the past, We also will kind of probably see us in the future as more of these issues that are more open to swinging come out. If we see another abortion case or another gay marriage case or another case that's similar to that on these social issues mostly, we might see a more swinging ability from John Roberts. We may see more votes that go against the majority or his fellow conservative justices. He also had a little bickering spat with President Trump earlier in the year when Trump came out and accused some justices of being Obama judges and everything, where Roberts said that we basically don't have any Obama judges, we don't have Bush judges, we don't have any presidents, don't own judges. But some may argue that you can kind of say that they are these judges that are owned by presidents in some way by their voting records. Most of these judges reflect the ideology of the presidents that put them in place. An Obama judge is more likely to be more liberal than the Trump judge. And a Bush judge is more likely to be a little bit more moderate, but lean to the right because Bush was a center-right conservative, more moderate than a Trump judge would be. Because Trump is obviously a more conservative president than Bush. Trump is governed way more conservatively than Bush. So you will kind of see us reflect either the views of the president or the climate that they have in the Senate. Like Kavanaugh was picked, for instance, because of the climate in the Senate. McConnell told Trump that he didn't think that he could get Amy Coney Barrett through, so Trump decided instead to pick Kavanaugh and have Kavanaugh go through instead of Barrett, which if you put Kavanaugh next to Gorsuch, they're two very different judges. Kavanaugh seems almost liberal next to Gorsuch, and Gorsuch seems like Barry Goldwater next to him. It depends on those two things. But right now, we kind of do see this kind of politicized judiciary and kind of seeing just whether or not the court's going to stay apolitical or go one way or another. Whether or not you see with the court packing with the Democrats in their candidates, or you see it as this red judiciary system being created by Mitch McConnell and others in the Republican-controlled Senate. So John Roberts is kind of this man kind of stuck in the eye of the storm, just trying to stop this from creating this political mess within the judiciary system, especially the Supreme Court. But it's yet to be seen whether or not he's going to be successful in achieving that and keeping it apolitical, or if he's just going to be a paper tiger and just keep on talking about it at college campuses. So that is yet to be seen. We probably will start seeing signs of it, or at least early signs of it, this coming term for the Supreme Court, but we won't really see anything fully fleshed out until there's probably a big case to come across, like another Obamacare case, or another abortion case, or another gay marriage case, like a big name case. We probably won't see anything like this until something like that, where we'll see a flip from Roberts or not. Then we can kind of take the temperature and see whether or not he's going to be more warm or more cool to doing this, which it's kind of too early to tell right now because the Supreme Court's been off when most of this talk has been happening, and they're just opening up sessions now. So we'll have to wait and see how this goes for the future. Basically, it's just going to be a watching game. You're going to have to sit and watch and wait for it all to happen. It might be a while, it might not. So it's just going to be just sit and wait and see what Roberts does. If he swings, then he's most likely going to walk the walk with what he's been talking. If not, then it's just been a bunch of gab. If it's a bunch of gab, then Roberts is just going along with it all. But if not, then he's actually going to try fighting to keep it apolitical, whether it be just at college campuses when he has speaking engagements, or when he actually has to come up with a vote. And this will probably be the defining issue of the Roberts Court in the future, whether or not the Supreme Court became politicized or not. And you can kind of argue that in the future, historians will probably look back, especially legal historians, and argue whether or not Roberts was successful in this mission. Tonight we have Congressman Chris Gibson joining us. Congressman Chris Gibson is a Siena alumni himself. He served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo as an Army officer, working his way up to the rank of colonel. So tonight we have him joining us, and we'll be talking about the Third Amendment. So the Third Amendment has to do with quartering soldiers. It's one of the first 10 amendments. It's part of the Bill of Rights. It's often referred to as the Forgotten Amendment because not many cases have come up about it. So tonight we're going to be discussing whether or not quartering soldiers is relevant and if it's relevant in today's world. And without further ado, we'll start this interview. So first off, Chris, can you please tell us an example of a court decision that has come up with the Third Amendment and why it's important? What was the ending factor of that court decision?
It actually was, the Third Amendment was part of an appellate decision, an important appellate decision in 1982, having to do with a case actually here in New York. We had a situation where we had prison guards, and they were on strike. And during that period of strike, the government activated National Guard troops, and they put them in as security for the prison. And the circumstances of this particular case in 1979 is that they housed the National Guardsmen in the very same barracks, if you will, that the prison guards were using. And so the prison guards sued, invoking the Third Amendment. And the appellate court actually said that they had standing. That now there were some complications with the case, and ultimately it was. What's important from a legal precedent is that they did say they had standing, number one, and number two, they defined National Guardsmen and women as soldiers. So that's going to be important for us going forward. And it did say that the prison guards were right to invoke this because they were claiming, in essence, that this was strike busting, the fact that they were putting them in there. But I think it's important because the courts acknowledge that this right actually extended even beyond, in this case, an individual's home, but it actually had to do with facilities that were being used by these prison guards. Now, you asked a more specific question.
Yes.
That is, what could be the possibilities that this could end up being invoked in now or in the future? And so in my research, I will tell you that the Cornell University Law School Journal has a very good piece on this. And they did some research in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. 2005, just a devastating storm that hit our country. And we ended up having to deploy tens of thousands of soldiers broadly defined here, not only active duty servicemen and women, but also guardsmen and women were deployed to New Orleans and the surrounding area to support the hurricane relief operations. Well, in the chaos that was the initial rescue and then recovery operations, the troops really had a dearth of facilities from which to live in. And, in some of their deployments, they were 90 to 120 days were they down in that part of the country. And so we had situations when these servicemen and women actually end up being housed in local areas. So, this was known at the time that there was potential issues with the Third Amendment. And so the guidance here is that, so coming out of this journal, actually, this law journal piece makes the point that at the federal and at the state level, legislators need to be sensitive to this issue. And if they think that there's going to be a natural disaster in the country where we're going to have to house servicemen and women, that there should be a law that addresses what the protocols are for their support, and that if servicemen and women are needed, if they must be housed in private property, that they set forward what the guidelines will be for reimbursement and also for getting permission in the event that that can be done as well. So all of this is to say that the reason why that amendment was put on the books is to protect people and their property from an overweening government. And even in the well-intentioned relief effort after a devastating natural disaster, the government has to be sensitive to its citizens, to their liberty, and to their property. And I think that that's really important. And, my research was actually stimulated by, I was on active duty then. I happened to have been in Iraq, but parts of our division, I was in the 82nd Airborne Division, parts of our division were actually sent to New Orleans. So I was aware of their experiences and how traumatic those experiences were for everyone involved, and how extensive the devastation was, and therefore the potential impacts of needing to house servicemen and women in those disaster areas. This is why it is still relevant to this day, because the government needs to outline what the process is going to be if they're going to do this, and then what the reimbursement will be.
Yeah, that definitely is an interesting take on it. I mean, today it kind of seems like, especially with today's circumstances surrounding it, that something like this involving a Third Amendment would only be taken up if there was like some huge tragedy in the country or some form of chaos, like you said, Katrina.
All right. Well, look, without belaboring the point too much, there could be some other aspects too here. Part of another deployment I had in 1991 was to support law enforcement, and it was called Operation Greenstock, and it was actually a counter-drug operation in the southwestern part of the United States. And so now in that circumstance, we were largely housed in a National Guard armory. But, one could imagine that if you were conducting extended operations in support of law enforcement, you could end up finding yourself camping out somewhere in some part of the United States, and you could end up on private property. So, and if that's the case, then one would hope that we're going to follow prescribed law here, and there'll be rents paid if there's any circumstance at all where where officers, I'm using the term here, or I should say officials of the United States government is involved in being on private property. We would hope that they would have coordinated that in advance. Permission, and that's the Third Amendment, and then also reimbursement. And here, that's where I mentioned at the outset of this interview why the Third Amendment in some ways is not only associated with the Fourth Amendment, but also the Fifth Amendment, because the Fifth Amendment talks about eminent domain. And of course, it lays out procedures for eminent domain, and that if it must be invoked, that the government has a responsibility to pay going rate for that. Same would be argued for Third Amendment here.
Yeah. Now, do you have any knowledge of what the compensation would be, since you said paying rent for this? Would you have any idea on what the compensation for something like this would be?
Well, I think it would vary, but the point, I think that what it comes down through case law is that it would be going rate. So that is why legislatures would need to be involved, because they could lay out some guidelines about how that was going to be determined. So, for example, today we actually have guidelines on going rate for Davis-Bacon. We have these prevailing wages laws, right? Not minimum wage, but prevailing wage. And this also has legal standing, prevailing wage. And what legislators are involved in is providing the guidelines that lay out how prevailing wage will be determined. Because obviously there's stipulation with regard to minimum wage, but not with prevailing wage. There's only guidelines. So, if you're going to have a circumstance, say there's, and let's be candid here, what we have noticed in the last decade is we've seen an increase in the frequency and the potency of these natural disasters. Yeah. And look, I mean, there's clearly been changes in climate. And this is one of the reasons why we have, even in our own area, we had Irene and Lee, hurricanes Irene and Lee, although I think Lee may have been a tropical storm at the end of the day. But still, Irene, and then we had Sandy 2 years later. And so we were having circumstances within 3 years. We had at least 2 500-year incidences. So either you believe that some infinitesimal statistical probability occurred, or you believe, as I do, that we have a new normal. And that new normal means that we're going to be faced increasingly with more of these storms, like Katrina, and like Irene and Lee. And so this is why, and I don't mean to blow this out of proportion. You'll recall I started this interview by saying that we need to look at the Third Amendment in relation to all the amendments, the Bill of Rights. But it does I believe, warrant a very serious response. You're asking about the Third Amendment. And so that's what I would tell you, is that is really the burden of government here, is to stay ahead of this. And that if we have a circumstance where officials, and let me say this last piece on officials,
Okay.
that was the other significant aspect of the appellate court decision, the 1982 appellate court decision, is that by determining that National Guardsmen and women were soldiers, one could argue this Cornell Law Journal article concluded that appellate court decision essentially means that any government official that shall be used in a government capacity would be treated the same as the word soldier is in the Third Amendment. So if you have not only National Guardsmen and women, but if you have FEMA officials that are activated and sent to a site, or even local law enforcement that has to spend time in private property, that there would be a system set up to approve that and then to reimburse that.
So I get the point being is that with a lot of this stuff you keep on, like we've been talking about, like with the case that we keep on bringing up in the appellate court, one of the things that comes with this is the interpretation of the Third Amendment. Would you say so?
Well, yeah, but that's not unusual, right? I mean, we do have case law with regard to all the amendments. You could take a look at the First Amendment, the Second Amendment. We're talking here about the Third, but the Fourth, the Fifth. They all have review by our Supreme Court, ultimately the Supreme Court. So, the fact that there's some interpretation here, that doesn't surprise me, nor do I get concerned by that.
Okay. So one thing I want to ask you, too, is why you think that the Third Amendment, which is often referred to as the Forgotten Amendment, why you think it's become so forgotten?
Well, I think that's a beautiful thing. Because we haven't had a recurrence of the abuse that King George visited upon the peoples here. So, that was the overriding motivation why we had the Bill of Rights in the first place, is as our founders were moving from the Articles of Confederation to the U.S. Constitution, clearly on the liberty-security continuum, we were moving more towards security. Again, to be fair to the founders, they believed wholeheartedly in liberty, but they also believed that liberty without a sense of order was really chaotic and therefore not securing liberty. So they were deliberately moving on that continuum more towards security. But in the process of doing that, they wanted to be very conscious of the abuses of Great Britain and King George. So as they were adopting the Constitution, and particularly prodded by states, including our own here in New York, because let's be candid here, the Bill of Rights was not part of the initial draft. And in fact, that's why, it's called the Bill of Rights. It actually comes as an addendum to the Constitution. But many of the states argued that their vote on ratification was contingent on these Bill of Rights being brought forward. So, that's what I would tell you in response to that is the Third Amendment, perhaps different from the other amendments. We haven't seen this widespread abuse. Again, there have been some cases that have pushed this a little bit. We talked about the 82 case. We've talked about the possibilities, the insightful article from Cornell Law that talked about the disasters. But that's the reason why it hasn't been as prevalent, is because we haven't had circumstances where we have citizens that are throwing their arms up saying the government's housing people here and they're not paying going rate. Now, let me also share with you, based on my experiences in Iraq, that it was fairly commonplace that U.S. soldiers were actually housed in Iraqi homes during our experiences. And what we did is we reimbursed the Iraqis we paid rent for our time that we spent in those homes. And in part, that was really driven by our experiences at the founding.
All right. Well, that definitely is an interesting anecdote to share, help bring a new perspective to the case. I also wanted to bring us back to one other point you said earlier about like the increasingness of these storms and other crises like that. Do you think that would create more of an environment for cases like the one that we keep on talking about in 1982 to come up?
No, it's possible. Look, I mean, that is one of the hypotheses of the changing climate, is that you're going to see, and in fact, this is not a radical statement I'm making here. All you have to do is look at the Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because their doctrine now, the doctrine that comes out of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the DoD, talks about climate changes and the impacts on scarcity and how that's going to cause changes in migration patterns, ultimately in contestation and conflict over scarce resources, water, food, shelter. And so that process of that changing climate could lead to more conflict. So it is not beyond the pale that you could see changes in the out years here that could lead to situations where we have to stabilize, like what happened in Katrina. We may end up having to help stabilize a region and recover, and that could lead to extensive deployment of servicemen and women, and the need potentially to house them, and then also, even disputes over what this all means. For example, you could have well-intentioned servicemen and women that are conducting a relief operation, and a citizen comes forward and says they're on my land, and there actually could be a dispute as to whether or not they're on the land, and then if they're on the land, what is the proper procedures to follow, including reimbursement.
So it all comes down to procedure. Now, do you have a reasoning for why you think, like, we keep on talking about these cases and why there's so few of them? Do you think there's many reasons behind, like, why these people don't make cases about this, or why they don't reach high levels?
Well, there is a place to study. If somebody was really interested in doing graduate work on this, I mean, you could actually look at the Civil War, because the U.S. Congress actually appropriated in 1865, and I think even in 1866, they appropriated a significant amount, for the time, a significant amount of money to pay claims. Now, the way this worked is if it was a state in rebellion, there was no reimbursement. However, there were Union forces that were in the process of staging or even defending Union territory. And soldiers in the Civil War actually had to stay in homes, and they actually had to, you might say, expropriate. I mean, they had to take food from locals, and they had to camp out on land. They had to chop trees. They had to take resources from private property.
Yeah.
Now, the Congress actually passed appropriations acts that actually paid back the people who were part of the Union that supported the Union armies. So if you were interested, if somebody was really interested in saying what kind of precedents were set there and what procedures were put in place, you could actually look it up and you could spend some time. I could imagine if somebody who was really interested in this could do a doctoral dissertation in this area and try to see what can be learned from that, and how, if we had to apply that to natural disasters, what would be the smart ways of doing that.
So it's all a matter of knowing history then.
It's always important. I've always found, I'm going to be biased now, but my major at Siena College was history, and I can tell you that it's been very important to me my whole life. My education at Siena helped me be a better officer in the United States Army. It helped me be a better member of Congress, more insightful member of Congress, and now teaching. Obviously, it's critical, but even beyond that, my everyday life, I'm just a curious person, in part because of natural disposition, but also because of my love of history. And so, I think it is important to have a sense of where we've been. I mean, obviously, judgment comes into play, and so you don't want to draw the wrong analogies, but I think a very firm handle and understanding of history can always put one in a stronger position to do better in the current day and then anticipating tomorrow.
Yeah, so now since we're on the topic of history, would you be able to willing to walk us through the history of the Third Amendment and how we got to the Third Amendment?
Yeah, I sure can. So, this was two things. It was part of the overall effort to, as I've mentioned, here in the interview to assert our natural rights and to make sure that government is clear that, they did not, unless they followed procedures, they were not to abridge these rights of citizens. I say follow procedures because, even the amendments do acknowledge there are times extraordinary times, when government has to take certain action. But, that's why you see, like, for example, warrants, the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment says that you have the right to be reasonably secure in yourself and in your property. And if the government wants to search you or even surveil you, they have to follow procedures. In this case, we're talking about the procedures for a warrant. So, it's the same with the Third Amendment. The Third Amendment lays out that, if there's going to be an occupation of a private property, that there has to be following law. There has to be a law that lays out what the procedures are, and then among those, including reimbursement. So that's part of this. It's an overall thrust to assert the codification of these rights. And now, explicitly with the Third Amendment, this was our experiences in the aftermath of the French and Indian Wars. We had British forces that were in the United States, in part for security. Yes, also to send a message to the colonists that they were to comply. We had some what we described as very onerous laws on us that were trying to extract resources to help pay for the French and Indian War. And, we, of course, learned this in our history. We learned about, the Boston Tea Party and a lot of these acts of insurgency, quite frankly, about what we viewed as unacceptable actions. And so, King George's response was to put troops and to intimidate us. He basically said, look, you can't get together in groups of more than three. Because, he was concerned about that we would be conspiring against him. Okay, so it turns out he was right on that one.
Very much so.
Yeah, but, the point is he made that edict. He wouldn't even open up our letters. I mean, we sent him petitions with colonists signing. I mean, at the time, before all that instability, we were actually considered loyalists. I mean, all of us, we were colonists that were loyal to the Great Britain and to the Crown. And so, in that transition period where we were sort of upset but still loyal, we were sending petitions to King George telling him, look, hey, we're upset about this or that, and we wanted his consideration. He wouldn't even open them. He wouldn't even consider. This is why, if you look at the First Amendment, it assures that we have the right to petition our government. So it's the same with the Third Amendment. As King George was laying down all these onerous laws, he was using an army to enforce them, including putting them in our homes. And so, one of the intolerable acts was that, that they had these troops that were in our homes. So in 1789, the architect for the Constitution, James Madison, was actually the initial author of the Third Amendment. And his draft that he put forward, we ended up pretty much, I would say like 75 to 80% of what his initial draft is what's in effect today, is what was ratified. And Madison, of course, you can read about him, about his views on this in the notes on the Constitution. He actually lays out his justification for this overall initiative, why it was important, why it should be written in a certain way. And then ultimately, he has the proceedings, the debate, and the minor edits that were put forward. But ultimately, it was to really put bounds on government.
Well, it definitely does have an interesting history. It's something definitely for our listeners out there, something worth looking into.
So let me close with this, though, Justin.
Okay.
Is that because, at first glance, you may say, well, we haven't really needed this amendment. It's never really been an issue. It's never been even adjudicated at the Supreme Court level. Perhaps we could do without it. I respect
there may be
all
some
points
who argue
of view.
that.
Yeah, I respect all points of view, but I would also submit that I don't think that's the way to look at this. To look at this amendment, I think the way to look at this amendment is it's part of an entire body here, the Bill of Rights, which really we hope to never use. I mean, we hope to never use any of these amendments, but that they are there as a clear communication to our government, because it's also important to remind ourselves that we created the government. The government didn't create the citizens created the government, and that in that creation, we also set forward the bounds of government. And that bounds of government also includes that the government cannot be capricious and onerous on our private property, including our homes, something that as Americans, we hold dear, is our privacy, and part of that privacy is inside our homes. And so that's I think the way to look at it, that the fact that we haven't needed it, I think is a blessing. It's a tremendous thing, but that we would always want to keep it, to always send that message to who's ever in our government, who's of course part of us, right? Because we're a government of the people, by the people, for the people, but that they understand that we expect them to follow the rules that have been laid down, because we are free people.
All right, before we go, I just have two quick questions for you.
Sure.
So the whole entire embodiment of this interview was whether or not the Third Amendment is still relevant. Would you say that it's still relevant today after everything we discussed today?
I do. I do think it's relevant. I've yielded the point that we haven't even needed to adjudicate this at the Supreme Court level, but I've made an argument despite that, why it is still relevant today. And I think it's this whole point that we need to look at it in its totality, that this Bill of Rights, this is really sacred and cherished for us.
All right. And then before we head out, you obviously are a big fan of history, and just wanted to know, would you have any, 2 or 3 recommendations for our audience of books or readings for people to look at to learn more about stuff like Third Amendment or military history or American history?
Well, if you're really all in here, look, I would tell you that Madison's notes, 2 volumes, at least the way that I have, but it's precious. It's unbelievable to me that Madison was able to keep such copious notes, given the fact that he is the initial drafter of the Constitution and therefore had a lot at stake at the amendment process, and still was heavily engaged in the debating himself, but yet comes away with such significant notes. And by the way, one way to test the veracity of his compendium is how often it was challenged, which was virtually zero. Had the other individuals who were in Philadelphia at the convention, had they thought that Madison materially got these arguments wrong, they would have said so. They would have published counter narratives. But, not that there weren't a few quibbles here and there, but by and large, the other attendees at the convention agreed with the analysis that Madison put forward, the notes on the Constitution. So, I would tell you that is a precious primary source to go to if you're really wanting to get into the details here of understanding the founding. Look, there's so many other pieces here that I just really enjoy, but there is a book I do recommend for folks if they want to have an appreciation of that era in relation to our own time, because sometimes we have a tendency to put it up on a pedestal, the founding era, and I don't think that's helpful either. As reverent as I am, and I think you sense that I am just because of my love of history, but I want to be clear. These founders had warts, they had lots of challenges, they had lots of imperfections. And if you want to get a sense of that, read Magnificent Catastrophe by a guy named Larson. It is a just fascinating read. It goes through the founding era, and it's really an in-depth analysis of the election of 1800, which was highly contested, obviously, between John Adams running for re-election and Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson obviously takes him out and becomes the president. But the book, Magnificent Catastrophe, really traces the founding, and it gives you tremendous insight. And at the same time, it also shows you the shortcomings of that generation. And I think that's in the challenges and how they dealt with those challenges. So, I would say that those two pieces, I've made 2 recommendations here this evening, and I could have made 200, but for the sake of parsimony here, I just keep it to 2. I went with a primary source here, and that's Madison's notes, and also a secondary source here, a recent publication by this guy named Larson called Magnificent Catastrophe. I'd recommend checking it out.
All right. Well, thank you for those recommendations. I'm pretty sure our listeners will be very interested in looking into them. So once again, thank you for doing this. We very much enjoyed your interview and hope you had a good night.
Hey, best wishes to you, Justin, and to everybody out there in Siena Saints land. God bless you, and I'm thinking of you and wishing you all the best.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Hey, everybody, I bet you didn't think you were going to hear my voice tonight. Well, I'm just here to say goodbye. I will join you next week with Justin. That was a great interview. I'm really proud of him. And you know what? If you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe on YouTube to Calling Out Controversy. Don't forget to listen to us again at WVCR 88.3 FM The Saint. Don't forget to like us on Instagram. Don't forget to email us. Don't forget to hit up the WVCR website. I'm here, he's here, we're all here, and we're a happy family. Thank you so much for supporting us all this time, and I really hope you enjoy the Summer of Rights. Episode 4, Searches and Seizures,